Daniel 10 through 12. This lesson is going to conclude our study of Daniel. This is all one vision, so that's why I want to deal with it in one video. As with the last chapter, remember the interpretation I'm giving is not the most popular view in our day. But what I'm seeking to show is that it's reasonable to interpret Daniel as referring to events that, while they were future to Daniel, they're past to us. This is commonly called a preterist view of prophecy. These prophecies are not speaking of some far-off future event, such as the end of the world, but are speaking of events which have already taken place from our point in time. I don't have time here to go into an in-depth analysis of other viewpoints, showing where they're in error and so on. I'm just trying to show that this interpretation is a reasonable one. So, let's dig in. When we get to chapter 10, we see in verses 1 through 3, as I said, this is all going to be one vision, and this is the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So this is 3 years after his decree to rebuild Jerusalem. And it's interesting here that it says the word was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. Okay, Belteshazzar. This was his name of exile. And so there's an emphasis here, the exile is still continuing. I mean, Cyrus has given this decree to rebuild Jerusalem, but there's a real sense in which the exile is still continuing. The people of Israel are still facing opposition, for example. When you read the book of Ezra, you see this opposition, and so Daniel is in mourning. Verse 2, Daniel was mourning for 3 weeks. See, because he realizes, things aren't going the way they should be. Things aren't going. It's not a glorious restoration now. So, as we go on down through here, I'm not going to have time to go in detail through everything, but he has this vision. You get down to chapter 10, verses 12 through 14, and he has this vision, this man clothed in linen, and he comes up to Daniel and he says, "Fear not, from the first day you've heard it." And he says, okay, who is this man? Who is this? What's going on here? He says, well, this is the angel of the Lord, and the angel of the Lord heard Daniel. When he had been praying and fasting, he had heard Daniel. And this says, by the way, that he was opposed. The prince of the kingdom of Persia, verse 13. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me not 21 days. Who was the prince of the kingdom of Persia? Well, that would have been Cambyses, who was a co-regent of Persia with Cyrus. And we read in history that Cambyses opposed the rebuilding of the temple, that he was that opposition to the rebuilding, until finally Cyrus removed him from being co-regent. And so I think that's what it's referring to here when he says the prince withstood me, but he was taken away, and now he's able to come. So I think that there's a reference to that here. Verse 13 then says, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me. Okay, so who is this Michael who stood up? Well, it says he's a chief prince, and he helps this messenger who came along. Okay, so what are we talking about here? Well, let's look in some other scriptures. Zechariah 3:2. Here we see Joshua the high priest. It says in verse 2, and the Lord said to Satan, the Lord rebuke you, O Satan, the Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is this not a brand plucked from the fire? And then we get to Jude verse 9. It says, when the archangel Michael, contending with the devil, was disputing about the body of Moses, he did not presume to pronounce a blasphemous judgment, but said, the Lord rebuke you. Here's a reference. And this was in Zechariah 3, this was Michael speaking. Michael stood up and arose at the end of time Now, Michael, Michael, who is like the Lord, he is being equated to the Lord himself, because it says Archangel Michael rebuked him and said, "The Lord rebuke you." I think what we see here is this equivalence, or this kind of going back and forth between Michael and actually Christ himself. It's kind of a combination that we're looking at here. So then, when we get on down into Daniel 12, if we were to move ahead and look at that, we see, again, at that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people. And he says that that's going to be until the time of the end. And so Michael says he stands up and arises at the end of the time Daniel prophesies about. And then the prophecy is closed up, or it's sealed up. It's shut up. Daniel is shown things that go up to the time of Christ, but not afterwards. This may be why the 70 weeks that we saw in the last chapter explicitly goes only through the middle of the 70th week. That's when Christ finished his work. The last 3.5 years are not really seen by Daniel. The prophecy in chapters 10 through 12 only goes to the time when Michael, or Christ, arises, and then the prophecy is closed up. That prophecy is going to be opened again in Revelation 6. In Revelation 6, you see this scroll that's sealed, and then it's opened. It's going to reveal God's plan for history after the first coming of Christ. But at this point, it's like, okay, Daniel, here's the time period I'm talking about with you, and that's it. Up to the coming of this Christ, up to the time of this work, that's it. Now, chapters 11 and 12, especially chapter 11, a lot of detail here refers to the kings of the north and the south. Here's a map that shows you a little bit about what it's talking about. These are 2 of the 4 kingdoms of Greece. Remember, we talked about this before, where Greece was split into 4 kingdoms. And so you have Syria, that was ruled by the Seleucids in the north in reference to Judah. Okay, they were north of Judah, so they would have been to the north. And Egypt, that was ruled by the Ptolemies in the south. Now, there's a handout, there's a paper that goes along with this video that called History in Daniel 11. And I'll let you read through this on your own, because it goes into a lot of detail going through chapter 11, showing the correlations of what chapter 11 says with what we know of history from this time period. And my point of that paper is to show how Daniel 11 corresponds with history from the time of Daniel to the time of Christ. So I don't believe we need to look at chapters 10 through 12 as referring to something in the future from us, that is, like end times things. It was future to Daniel. He was given a prophetic vision of what was going to happen over the next 400 odd years. But it's past history for us. I don't have time here to go through this in detail to refute other interpretations, but I hope it shows you it's reasonable to read Daniel 11 as referring to things that have already happened. And that's, again, a preterist approach to prophecy. This approach sees much of biblical prophecy as referring to things that have already happened. Not all. Okay, there's still things yet to come. But I think Daniel, Matthew 24, even most of the book of Revelation refer to things that have already happened, but which were given to teach us as well. So we're going to move ahead now to chapter 12 and look at the conclusion. When we look at verses 1 through 4, we see that this is a conclusion of the prophecy begun in chapter 11, and there's 6 main things to deal with. There's Michael standing up, there's a time of trouble. He says, many are going to awaken from the dust of the earth. He says, the wise will shine, many will run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. So let's look at these things and see what we're being taught. First, think about it when it says, Michael shall stand up. So when does this happen? What happens at that time? What time? It's the time spoken of at the end of chapter 11. Now, remember, the chapter and verse numberings are not inspired, so don't think about a break between the end of chapter 11 and the beginning of chapter 12. It's just one prophecy. The end of chapter 11, as I say in the paper that I attached, is dealing with King Herod. That's the time frame we're looking at. That's the time when Michael stands up. So here we see Michael again. He's called a great prince, or a leader. He's also described as one who stands watch over the people of God. And I believe this is referring to Jesus under the term of Michael. He came, or he arose, in the time of Herod the king, the time context of the passage. He is our great prince. He is our leader. He preeminently stands watch over us. But if we see Michael as an angelic being and not as Christ, it's still the case. It's still the case that he's doing his work here at the time of King Herod. So now, what is the time of trouble? Well, it says it's described as something worse than anything that's happened before then. Okay, remember, it's still dealing with the same time frame. There's nothing to indicate a gap of time here. During the time of the Herods, and in chapter 11, it seems to deal with the whole line of Herods, from Herod the Great, who was the Herod at the birth of Jesus, to Herod Agrippa II, who ruled until the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. There was great siege, there was great distress, there was great trouble, which culminated in the events of AD 70 at the destruction of Jerusalem. So the coming of Christ, or the rising up of Michael, as we're speaking of, resulted in judgment on unbelieving Israel. However, the faithful, he says, your people, faithful were delivered. Even as Jesus said in Matthew 24, where he said, those who are on the housetops, don't come down, flee, that if you follow what Jesus said, you would be saved. And in history, when we look at the destruction of AD 70, we see that the Christians who took the words of Jesus' prophecy seriously left Jerusalem and they weren't destroyed. It says that these are the ones written in the book. If you look back at Exodus 32, we see another time when this idea of having a book written, where Moses says, now if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. But the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. There's a list or a book that God keeps of who are his true people. And this will come back again, too, in the book of Revelation, where we see this concept of a book or a list that God keeps. But let's think about now this time of trouble, okay, time of 70 AD. Sometimes we're not aware, we've forgotten how bad this was. Josephus, historian, not a Christian historian, said about that time, the misfortunes of all men from the beginning of the world, if they be compared to those of the Jews, are not so considerable as they were. And he also said, neither did any other city ever suffer such miseries, nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was from the beginning of the world. The destruction of Jerusalem was a catastrophic event. There was tremendous suffering, tremendous misery. And so when we're told that there would never be another one like it, okay, this was what it was talking about. So, what's the time frame that we're looking at? Before we go on to verse 2, I want to look ahead to verse 7, because this is going to help us understand these other verses. In verse 7, we see when all these things will be finished. That's how it ends up. He ends up in verse 7, it says, all these holy people comes to an end, all these things will be finished. So, the completion of all that was just prophesied is going to happen by such and such a time. And it'll be finished by that time. So what is that time? Well, it's the time when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, or the power of the holy people comes to an end. When was that? Well, that happened at the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. The holy people, it is the people of Israel, was totally shattered. It was destroyed. God poured out his judgment on them for their rejection of the Messiah. And so this is the time frame that we have here at the end of verse 7. It says all this is going to take place. The entire vision, chapters 10 through 12, deals with the time until AD 70. It doesn't go beyond that. All that is prophesied is completed by AD 70. So, now let's back up to verse 2 so it helps us understand these verses. It says, many shall awaken. Our first inclination when you read this is to see this referring to the final resurrection at the end of time. This is what people popularly teach. We've heard it so often that it's like we automatically think that way. But it cannot mean that. I mean, this would mean a total disconnect with the previous verses. And he's been talking about these things that are happening up until the time of AD 70, and he's not just going to throw in, okay, by the way, at the end of time there's going to be a resurrection. All the events of chapter 11 deal with historical events from Daniel's time right down to the coming of Christ. This, if this is the final resurrection, would be a sudden jump over thousands of years of history, and there's nothing in the text to indicate that. Besides, it would violate that time marker in verse 7 that all these things will be finished by AD 70. So what's meant by these people who are sleeping being awakened? Now, sleep and awake can refer to physical resurrection. And Paul refers to those who have died as having fallen asleep. But it doesn't necessarily mean that. Let's look at some passages here. Isaiah 29:10. For the Lord has poured out upon you a spirit of deep sleep, and has closed your eyes, the prophets, and covered your heads, the seers. This refers to those who are asleep, but it refers to false prophets and leaders. It says they have the spirit of deep sleep. Isaiah 60, verse 1. Arise, shine, for your light has come. It's calling on Israel to arise and shine. Ephesians 5:14 quotes a variation of this verse, saying it means for Israel to awake from their sleep, and even to arise from the dead and receive the light of Christ. This isn't speaking about a resurrection, it's speaking about waking from spiritual death. Ezekiel 37:1-14 is the valley of dry bones, and this uses the language of being raised from the dead. But that passage isn't speaking about the final resurrection, it's speaking about the nation of Israel being reconstituted and restored, being reborn in a sense. They were called to awaken and to live. Finally, we can look at John 5:25. Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. This speaks of the dead hearing the voice of Christ and living, and Jesus says that was happening in his day. It is now here. But he's speaking of a resurrection. Now there's a second resurrection Jesus speaks of in verse 28. He says an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out. He doesn't say the hour is coming and now is in verse 28. He says it's coming. It's future. So there's two resurrections Jesus is speaking of. Verse 25, he's speaking about the resurrection of new life, of regeneration. These verses, though, show that when the language of resurrection, of sleeping, of awakening is used, it often refers to something other than the final physical resurrection at the end of time. Again, remember it takes place before 70 AD. John the Baptist, Jesus, the apostles and evangelists called on Israel to awaken, to arise, to hear the word of God. As they heard, some did awaken, and they were saved to everlasting life. Others heard that same message. They were awakened from their slumbers in the sense that they were kind of roused up and heard things, but they rejected the gospel. And so they would have shame and everlasting contempt. So when he says many shall awaken, I believe that's what Daniel is referring to here, is this idea of people coming to new life. Many shall come to new life. The wise shall shine. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sun above. Compares them to the firmament and the stars. Okay. Again, let's look at scriptures and see what we're speaking of here. Matthew 5:14 through 16. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, and so on. So here's this idea of Christians being a light, shining. Philippians 2:14 and 15. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. And then Ephesians 5:8 contrasts our old life of darkness. He says, at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. And so the wise are those who shine. They're faithful Christian witnesses, especially preachers of the gospel. But they're those who shine the light of God. We can think back to Genesis 1. God made the lights, the firmament, the stars, the lights, and we see there that stars are symbolic of rulers because God gave the lights to rule the night and the day. And if we look in Romans 16:20, this gives us a little bit more insight. The God of Prince will soon crush Satan under your feet. This speaks of our rulership and the idea of preaching the gospel, of shining, of being wise and shining, is our means of rule. It's our means of dominion, turning many to righteousness. Okay, next point in Daniel 12 is that many shall run to and fro. What does it mean, many shall run to and fro? I mean, popular writers refer this like to rapid transportation and people traveling all over the earth quickly and so on. This idea of running to and fro just mainly means to go around. That's what running means. And I have some verses here. I'll let you look these up on your own. But these verses in 2 Chronicles and Jeremiah and Zechariah use the same phrase, running to and fro, just simply to refer to moving all around, going around. It's not like rapidity. It's not something like that. But let's look at a few verses here. Matthew 28:19. We're familiar with Matthew 28:19 as part of the Great Commission. Jesus told his disciples, go, therefore, make disciples of all nations. He's telling them to go into the earth. Mark 16:20 says, they went out, the apostles, and preached everywhere. They're going out. And then we have Habakkuk 2 and 3. And the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it, for still the vision awaits its appointed time, and so on. This idea that the gospel message is going to go all around. Many shall go around, many shall run to and fro, go around the earth. The gospel message will spread all over the world. The messengers are those who run with those tidings. So what's referred to here is the gospel spreading around the world. Many are going to go all around the world spreading the gospel. He says knowledge shall increase. Okay, is this referring to the fact that this is the information age and we have more information than any time in history? We have the internet with knowledge to everyone and technology is changing. No, let's look at this in the context of Daniel. Okay. Let's look at a couple of passages here. 1 Corinthians 15:34. Wake up from your drunken stupor, as is right, and do not go on sinning, for some have no knowledge of God. Knowledge. That's not just knowing a bunch of facts, being able to do well on Jeopardy. Okay, it's knowledge of God. Colossians 1:10. Walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to Him, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God. There's this idea of knowledge increasing. So this knowledge that shall increase is knowledge of the gospel. So as these preachers, as we saw in the last time, running to and fro, as they go to and fro, they're bringing true knowledge. They're bringing gospel knowledge to many. And so this knowledge increased in the first century as preachers, as the apostles went out over the earth. Now, after the conclusion of this prophecy, verse 4, Daniel said, "Shut up the words, seal the book until the time of the end." So he's told to seal that. Verse 4, verse 9, he says, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end." The prophecies are given, they cover up to a certain point. And we believe that's the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. No further. That's all that's revealed to Daniel. Okay? That's the time period he sees. It's like, okay, up until that time, and then that's it. When you get to Revelation chapter 5 and following, those seals of prophecy are reopened. I mean, there's a vision there that John has in the book of Revelation where the scroll is opened. More prophecy is given at that time. So verse 6, verses 5 and 6 refer to two men or angels, one of whom asked the other how long it shall be. Literally, it says, how long the end of these wonders. Verse 6, how long the end of these wonders. This isn't referring to a point in time. It's not saying, okay, when is this going to happen? But it's rather asking how long it's going to last. And what wonders is he talking about? Well, it's the time of the trouble that he's just spoken of. This will be a wondrous thing. Well, let's look at a couple of passages here. Luke 21:22. For these are days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. Luke here speaking about this time of tribulation, of the destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew 24:22. Also, I believe, speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem. If those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. So these are days of great distress for Israel. And so he's saying, okay, how long is this going to last? How long will those troubles be? So he says that it's for time, times, and apart. Literally, that's what he says. Now, we looked at something like this previously in a previous chapter. I don't believe this is referring to a specific length of time, like a year, but rather just to some indefinite length of time. So it's a period of time that this time of trouble is going to be. It's extended times. It's made plural. Okay, it's going to last a while, but then it's cut short. It's part of a time. It shall cut off. And this is the length of the main time of the distress, that there will be a time of troubles. It's going to be extended. It's not going to be over quickly, but then there will come a sudden end to it. Now, this raises a problem for Daniel's understanding because there's no anchor point for this time period. It's going to happen before the total destruction of Jerusalem, but otherwise, when is this going to happen? So Daniel asks, what is the end of these things? And the answer comes in verses 11 and 12. This is where we get into the days. He says in verse 11, it's going to be from the time the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. One end of that desolation, one end of that 1,290-day period is when the daily sacrifice is ended. The other end of the period is the abomination of desolation. Now this doesn't tell Daniel a precise date, but it tells him some time markers of the time of great trouble. What is this abomination of desolation? We've seen this previously in Daniel. Now, I don't believe that there's just one abomination of desolation. I don't think it's the same one that's spoken of in chapter 11, verse 31, when Menelaus desecrated the temple in the days of Antiochus. And I think to help us understand how this, why isn't it the same thing? How can there be more than one? For a parallel type of understanding, let's look at 1 John. Okay, this is not speaking about abomination of desolation, but I think it helps us to understand how this type of thing can work. Because in 1 John 2:18, John says, "Children, it is the last hour, and as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come." John speaks about Antichrist, but he says there are many Antichrists. See, popular literature likes to think that there's one big Antichrist. John tells us there were plural Antichrists in his day. And I think the same thing is happening with the abomination of desolation. There's one in chapter 11 in the time of Antiochus. There's another one happening here, which is at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. To support this, let's look at a couple of passages. Matthew 24:15 and 16. In Matthew 24:15 and 16, Matthew refers to this passage. He says, "When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place," let the reader understand, "then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Okay, keep that in mind. Matthew talks about this abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel. Let's look, though, at the parallel passage in Luke 21, verses 20 and 21. Luke, writing about the same speech that Jesus gave, says, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains," and so on. See, here's the difference. Matthew was writing for a Jewish audience who would have known the prophecies of Daniel. They would know what he referred to by the abomination of desolation. Luke was writing to a Gentile, and so he editorially translated that concept. He didn't use the phrase abomination of desolation. He explains it. What it means is Jerusalem surrounded by armies. He substitutes Jerusalem surrounded by armies for abomination of desolation. So I believe that's what Matthew is speaking of as well, the time when Jerusalem would be surrounded by armies. That's the abomination of desolation. So this trouble would last for 1,290 days. That's the time between the siege of Jerusalem and the ending of the sacrifices. Now the Hebrew grammar here actually doesn't specify which one comes first. It's just that you have this 1,290-day period. At one end of it is the siege of Jerusalem. The other end is the ending of sacrifices. 1,290 days works out to be 43 months. And when we read history, we see that the siege of Jerusalem began in November of AD 66. The daily sacrifices ended in July of AD 70. If you count up, there's 43 complete months between those two. Okay, you got partial months on either end, but you have 43 months. The siege of Jerusalem begins, daily sacrifices ended. 43 months, 1,290 days. So what about the 1,335 days it's mentioned? Okay, that's an extra 45 days, or 1.5 months after the end of the sacrifice. Now, history tells us that the siege of Jerusalem ended suddenly. It was like it was going on, then all of a sudden it ended. Titus gained a sudden possession of the city. It was seemingly miraculous. And if we look at Matthew 24 again, Matthew 24:22, "If those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." Okay, so the days were shortened for the sake of the elect. Titus didn't have to prolong that siege any longer. He was able to quit. And so there was a blessing to those who lasted that 1,335 days, that extra month and a half. Titus gave clemency to the survivors. He set free the captives. Those who lasted that long then were blessed. Now, this is just the main points that we've looked at in chapter 12, and in fact in chapters 10 through 12, particularly those things that might be in dispute. Again, if you did a further study, you would need to look at alternative interpretations, show where they're in error. But again, we can see it's reasonable, it makes sense, to see all these events as referring to things that have already taken place, and not have to throw them into the far distant future, or the far distant future from Daniel. It makes perfectly good sense to interpret this vision as a narrative of history from Daniel's day to the time of Jesus, up to the destruction of Jerusalem. That doesn't do violence to the text. It's not stretching or allegorizing things. It interprets phrases the same way they're used elsewhere in Scripture. So this concludes our study of the book of Daniel. I hope it's been helpful for you. Hope it's given you some things to think about, and most of all, I hope that it's helped you to grow closer to the Lord and to learn how you might serve Him more effectively. Thank you for watching.